A late-night drive home, a routine stop it, should have been simple. Instead, I found myself fighting for breath. My life in the hands of a man who saw my skin color, not my humanity. The world dissolved into a strobing kaleidoscope of red and blue. 1 second, I was humming along to a late-night jazz station, my mind still buzzing from a successful contract negotiation. The next, my rearview mirror was a flashing emergency, painting the supple leather interior of my Mercedes in frantic pulsing strokes. I let out a sigh, my shoulders slumping. It was almost midnight on a Tuesday. I was tired, I was sober, and I just wanted to get home to my husband, David. I pulled over smoothly, killed the music, and rolled down the window, placing my hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, just as David had always drilled into me. Hands visible, Maya. No sudden moves. Be polite, be respectful, but know your rights. It was a conversation we'd had too many times, a grim ritual for every black person in America, even for someone like me, a corporate attorney who billed at $900 an hour. The crunch of gravel under heavy boots grew louder, and a figure materialized beside my door, a hulking silhouette against the blinding headlights of his patrol car. He didn't speak, just shined a mag light directly into my eyes, forcing me to squint and turn my head away. "Good evening, officer," I said, my voice steady, despite the adrenaline beginning to prickle at my skin. "License and registration," he grunted, the words clipped and devoid of any courtesy. The beam of light finally moved from my face to scan the interior of my car, lingering on my briefcase on the passenger seat, my designer handbag. His gaze felt like a physical intrusion, an accusation. "Of course," I replied, moving with deliberate slowness. "My registration and insurance are in the glove compartment. My license is in my purse. I'm going to reach for them now, very slowly." He said nothing, just watched, his hand resting casually on the butt of his holstered firearm. The air was thick with a tension that felt entirely one-sided. I retrieved the documents, my fingers surprisingly nimble, and handed them out the window. He snatched them from my hand. The maglite beam followed the documents up to his face, illuminating a square jaw clenched tight and a pair of cold, pale eyes that seemed to be searching for a problem. "Maya Elizabeth Turner," he read aloud, then looked back at me, a smirk playing on his lips. "This is a nice car for a... Maya." The pause was infinitesimal, but I heard it. I felt it. It was a chasm of insinuation and prejudice. I took a slow, deep breath, keeping my expression neutral. "I've worked very hard for it, officer. Was there a reason you pulled me over?" "You rolled through that stop sign back there," he said, his tone dismissive. I knew for a fact I hadn't. I was a creature of habit and caution, especially when driving alone at night. I'd come to a complete 3-second stop, just like I always did. "I'm quite certain I came to a full stop, sir," I stated, my voice respectful but firm. His smirk widened into a sneer. "Are you calling me a liar?" "Not at all, officer," I said, my heart starting to hammer against my ribs. "I am simply stating my recollection of events." He leaned down, bringing his face closer to my open window. The smell of stale coffee and aggression wafted in. "You know you people always have an answer for everything, don't you? Can't just accept you did something wrong." "You people." The words hung in the air, a toxic cloud. Every alarm bell in my head, every warning David had ever given me, began to clang in a deafening chorus. This wasn't about a stop sign anymore. It never was. "I think I have the right to know why I was truly pulled over," I said, my own training as a lawyer kicking in. The fear was still there, a cold knot in my stomach, but it was now mingled with a rising tide of indignation. "You've got a real mouth on you, you know that?" he said, his voice dropping to a low growl. He straightened up. "Step out of the car." "Am I being detained, officer?" I asked, keeping my hands on the wheel. "Are you placing me under arrest?" I said, "Step out of the car. Now." The command was sharp, a crack of a whip. "Officer, with all due respect, I have not done anything to warrant." I didn't get to finish. My door was wrenched open with such force that it slammed against its hinges. "I'm not going to tell you again," he roared, his face contorted in rage. He reached in, his hand clamping down on my upper arm like a vice. His fingers dug into my flesh, and I cried out in a mixture of shock and pain as he hauled me from the driver's seat. My heels scraped against the asphalt as I stumbled to find my footing. He spun me around and slammed me against the side of my own car. The cold metal shocked my skin through the thin silk of my blouse. My head connected with the window with a sickening thud, and for a moment the world swam in a dizzying haze of red and blue lights. "You think you're so smart," he spat, his voice right next to my ear, his body pressing me hard against the vehicle. "You think your fancy car and your fancy clothes mean you're above the law?" Tears of fury and terror pricked my eyes. "You have no right," I gasped out, my voice trembling. "I want your name and your badge number." That was the mistake. It was the final challenge his fragile ego couldn't withstand. I felt his body tense, a surge of pure, unrestrained fury. His hand shot from my arm, not to my wrists for handcuffs, but to my neck. His thick, leather-gloved fingers wrapped around my throat, squeezing with brutal, instantaneous pressure. My airway was cut off. I couldn't scream. I couldn't breathe. My hands flew up, clawing uselessly at his wrist as black spots began to dance in my vision. He was choking me, leaning in with all his weight, his face a mask of triumphant hatred. The last thing I registered was the cold, indifferent metal of my own car pressing against my cheek as the world began to fade to black. A primal, desperate instinct took over. My nails, meticulously manicured just that morning, raked across his glove, scrabbling for purchase, for any kind of leverage. Just as the last pinpricks of light were about to extinguish, a new set of headlights washed over us, cutting through the night from the opposite direction. A horn blared, long and loud. The pressure on my throat vanished so abruptly that I collapsed, sliding down the side of my car to the gritty asphalt. I was a heap of silk and terror, my body convulsing as I took in ragged, searing gulps of air. Each breath was a fire in my lungs, my throat a raw, bruised passage. My vision swam, but I could make out a second patrol car parked askew, its headlights pinning us like specimens. A younger officer was getting out, his face a mask of confusion and alarm. "Miller, what the hell is going on?" the new officer called out, his voice tight with concern. The man who had just tried to kill me, Miller, straightened his uniform, his chest puffing out. He was already composing his lie, building a fortress of blue privilege around his monstrous act. "She was resisting," he barked, his voice still laced with adrenaline. "Became combative, tried to grab for my weapon." A strangled sound, half sob, half laugh, escaped my raw throat. Tried to grab his weapon? I was a 5'6" corporate lawyer in 3-inch heels. He was a mountain of muscle and rage. The absurdity of his claim was staggering, but I knew, with a terrifying certainty, that it was his word against mine. And in this desolate stretch of road, his word was law. I need a supervisor," I rasped, pushing myself up with trembling arms. My voice was a hoarse whisper. "I need medical attention. He assaulted me." The younger officer, whose name tag I could now just make out as Evans, looked from me, crumpled and gasping on the ground, to Miller, standing there radiating a false sense of control. I could see the conflict in Evans's eyes, the flicker of doubt warring with the ingrained instinct to back his partner. "She's hysterical," Miller said, taking a step towards me. I flinched, scrambling back on my hands and knees until my back hit the tire. Ran the stop sign, got lippy, and then escalated when I asked her to step out of the vehicle. You know how they get. They. There it was again. A venomous little word that explained everything and excused nothing. Evans took a hesitant step forward, his hand hovering near his radio. "Miller, maybe we should just write the ticket and let her go. This looks—" He trailed off, gesturing vaguely at the scene, at me. "Looks like what, Evans?" Miller snapped, his voice dropping dangerously low. "Looks like proper procedure when a suspect gets violent. Are you questioning my methods?" Evans's courage seemed to evaporate under the heat of Miller's glare. He dropped his hand, his gaze falling to the ground. "No, sir. Of course not." I knew then that I had no ally here. Evans was either too scared or too indoctrinated to help. I was on my own. My legal mind, though clouded by fear and a lack of oxygen, began to fire up. Evidence, I needed evidence. My car had a dash cam. It was integrated, subtle, but it was there. David had insisted on it. "You're making a mistake," I croaked, finding a sliver of my professional voice. "A grave mistake. I am a lawyer. I know my rights. You choked me. That is felony assault on a civilian." Miller laughed, a short, ugly bark. "A lawyer? Oh, that's rich. Let me guess. One of those public defenders, fighting for your criminal buddies?" Hey, he turned to Evans. "See? Mouthy. Just like I said." "Turn around," he commanded, his attention snapping back to me. "You're under arrest." "For what?" I demanded, my voice cracking. "For being assaulted by you?" "For assaulting an officer. For resisting arrest. We can add a few more if you keep running that mouth of yours." He pulled out his handcuffs, the metallic click echoing in the tense silence. He grabbed my arm again, yanking me to my feet. The world tilted violently, and I cried out as he twisted my arms behind my back with unnecessary force. The cold steel bit into my wrists, ratcheting tight enough to cut off circulation. My mind was racing, a frantic search for a lifeline. My phone. I needed my phone. I needed to call David. As Miller shoved me towards the back of his patrol car, I saw my purse lying on the ground where it had fallen, its contents spilled across the asphalt. My wallet, my lipstick, and there, face down, was my phone. Just before Miller pushed me into the cage-like back seat, I saw its screen light up. A picture of David and me on our wedding day appeared, vibrant and happy, under the single word, husband. He was calling. He was probably worried, wondering why I wasn't home yet. Miller followed my gaze. He saw the lit-up screen. With a slow, deliberate motion, he bent down and picked up the phone. He looked at the screen, at the picture of the smiling, handsome black man I called my husband. Then he looked at me, trapped in the back of his car. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face, a look of pure, malicious power. He pressed his thumb to the screen. The ringing stopped. And then, instead of putting it with my other belongings, he slipped my phone into his own pocket before slamming the car door shut, plunging me into a silent, terrifying darkness. The ride to the station was a surreal, silent nightmare. The partition between me and the front was thick, soundproof plastic. I could see the back of Miller's head, see him occasionally glance at his partner, Evans, but I couldn't hear a word they said. I was a specimen in a jar, a problem to be processed. The adrenaline from the assault had begun to ebb away, leaving behind a deep, throbbing ache in my throat and a cold, heavy dread in the pit of my stomach. The cuffs on my wrists were a constant, painful reminder of my utter powerlessness. Every legal argument, every clause of the Constitution I had ever memorized, felt like a foreign language now, useless against the brute force of Miller's prejudice. He hadn't just arrested me. He had stolen my voice, first with his hands, then by taking my phone. He had cut me off from David, my anchor, my fiercest protector. The image of him pocketing my phone, that smug smile on his face, burned behind my eyelids. It wasn't just about silencing me. It was about enjoying it. When we arrived at the precinct, the process was one of methodical humiliation. Miller hauled me out of the car, his grip on my arm bruisingly tight, and paraded me through a brightly lit booking area. Eyes followed us, some curious, some indifferent, some with a flicker of the same contempt I saw in Miller's. I was no longer Maya Turner, corporate attorney. I was just another black woman in handcuffs, another statistic in their nightly haul. They took my mugshot, the flash of the camera a harsh, repeated assault. They fingerprinted me, the cold, sticky ink coating my fingers, another layer of grime on an already sullied evening. I tried to speak up, to demand a phone call, to state clearly that I had been assaulted, but my voice was still a shredded whisper. Miller was always there, hovering, his presence a suffocating blanket of intimidation. When the booking sergeant, a weary-looking man with a droopy mustache, asked for the arresting officer's statement, Miller launched into his pre-rehearsed fiction. Subject was belligerent from the moment of the stop, he droned, his voice a flat monotone of practiced falsehood. Refused to comply with lawful orders to exit her vehicle. Became physically aggressive, attempted to strike me, forcing a physical takedown. Resisted cuffing. He didn't mention choking me, Of course he didn't. He painted me as an unhinged aggressor, and himself as the calm, professional officer forced to respond. Evans stood silently beside him, his gaze fixed on a spot on the far wall, a pillar of complicit silence. "I need to make a phone call," I rasped, my throat feeling like it was lined with sandpaper. "It's my right." The booking sergeant glanced at me, then back at Miller. Miller shook his head slightly, a barely perceptible motion. "You'll get your call when we're done processing you," the sergeant mumbled, turning back to his computer. My heart sank. They were stonewalling me, isolating me. They put me in a holding cell with 2 other women. One was crying softly in the corner, the other was asleep on the narrow concrete bench, her snores rattling in the small space. The cell smelled of sweat and despair. I sat down on the cold floor, my back against the grimy wall, and finally let the tears I'd been holding back trace hot paths down my cheeks. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was a profound, soul-crushing sense of injustice. I had done everything right. I had been polite. I had followed the rules. And for that I had been assaulted and arrested, my life turned upside down by one man's bigotry and unchecked power. Hours crawled by. I had no idea what time it was. The fluorescent lights of the holding cell hummed endlessly, erasing the passage of night into morning. My hope began to fray at the edges. What if David didn't know where I was? He'd be calling my phone, getting no answer. He'd be sick with worry. He'd call my office, my parents, the hospitals. Would he even think to call the police precincts? And if he did, would they even tell him I was here? Just as I was sinking into a pit of hopelessness, the heavy cell door clanged open. A female officer stood in the doorway. "Turner, Maya," she called out, her voice devoid of emotion. "You're making bail." Relief washed over me so intensely it made me dizzy. David. It had to be David. He'd found me. He was here. I scrambled to my feet, my legs stiff and unsteady. They led me back to the booking desk, where the sergeant pushed a small plastic bag of my belongings across the counter. My purse, my keys, my wallet, but not my phone. "Where's my phone?" I asked, my voice a little stronger now. "Officer Miller logged it as evidence," the sergeant said without looking up. "Part of the assault on an officer charge." Of course, it was the one piece of tangible proof I had against him, and he had buried it in an evidence locker under a mountain of lies. It had my husband's contact info, my law firm's, everything. He was trying to erase me. As I signed the paperwork, my hands still trembling, I scanned the waiting area, my heart pounding in anticipation. I expected to see David's tall, reassuring figure, his face etched with worry but ready to wrap me in his arms. But he wasn't there. Instead, a man in an impeccably tailored, expensive suit stood up from one of the plastic chairs. He was older, with sharp blue eyes, a mane of silver hair, and a face that radiated an aura of calm, lethal authority. I recognized him instantly. He was Arthur Vance, one of the most powerful defense attorneys in the city, a man whose reputation was legendary. I'd seen him in court, but we'd never spoken. Standing beside him was a younger associate from his firm, holding a briefcase. Arthur Vance walked towards me, his expression a mixture of professional sympathy and grim determination. "Ms. Turner," he said, his voice a low, resonant baritone. "I'm Arthur Vance. I'm here to represent you. Your husband sent me." I was so relieved I could have wept. "My husband? David, where is he? Is he okay?" Vance gave a tight, thin smile that didn't reach his eyes. "He's fine. He's preparing. He asked me to get you out of here and make sure you're okay." He glanced around the grimy precinct, his gaze lingering for a moment on the booking sergeant, who suddenly seemed very interested in his paperwork. "And then," Vance continued, his voice dropping to an almost conspiratorial whisper, "he wants me to get the name of every single officer involved in this incident, especially the arresting officer. It seems your husband has a professional interest in a man named Miller." I looked at him, confused. A professional interest? What did that mean? Before I could ask, the main doors of the precinct swung open with a bang. Framed in the doorway stood my husband, David. But it wasn't the David I knew, the man who wore soft sweaters and argued with me about who forgot to take out the recycling. This was David Turner, Assistant United States Attorney for the Southern District, flanked by two stern-looking men in dark suits who could only be federal agents. He was dressed in a razor-sharp suit of his own, his face a mask of cold, controlled fury. His eyes scanned the room, bypassing everyone until they locked on mine. The raw, protective rage in his gaze was so potent, it was almost a physical force. Then his eyes moved, slowly, deliberately, and settled on Officer Miller, who had just walked back into the booking area, holding a cup of coffee. Miller's smug expression faltered, a flicker of confusion crossing his face as he took in the sight of the three men who had just stormed his station. He clearly had no idea who he was looking at. He just saw another black man in a suit. David took a slow step into the room, his voice echoing in the suddenly silent space, low, clear, and dripping with ice. "Officer Miller," he said, and the way he said the name made it sound like a death sentence. "I'm David Turner. You have my wife's phone in your pocket, and you and I are about to have a very long, very detailed conversation about your career." A profound electric silence fell over the precinct. Every cop in the room, from the booking sergeant to the officers milling about, froze. The name David Turner hung in the air, thick with unspoken weight. Miller, however, was still cocooned in his own arrogance. He straightened up, a smirk returning to his face as he took in David's suit and confident demeanor. He saw a challenge, not a threat. "Is that a fact?" Miller sneered, taking a step forward. "You need to calm down, buddy, or you'll end up in a cell right next to your wife. Now get out of my station." One of the federal agents beside David took a subtle step forward, but David held up a hand, stopping him without even looking. His eyes never left Miller. "This is no longer your station, officer," David said, his voice dangerously calm. "This is now the focal point of a federal investigation into civil rights violations, starting with the felony assault you committed against my wife, Maya Turner." He finally glanced at me, his eyes softening for a fraction of a second, a silent promise that the nightmare was over. Then they snapped back to Miller, hard as obsidian. "She's also a member of the state bar, you idiot. Did you even bother to run her name?" Miller's smirk finally faltered. The cogs were turning, slowly, grinding against the thick sludge of his prejudice. He looked from David's unyielding face to the two grim-faced federal agents, to Arthur Vance, the legal shark he now recognized, and finally to me. The dismissive contempt in his eyes curdled into a dawning, sickening horror. He was beginning to understand the catastrophic scale of his miscalculation. I don't know what you're talking about," he stammered, the bravado evaporating like mist. "She was resisting arrest." "Was she?" David asked, his voice a silken threat. He took another step, closing the distance between them. "Because my wife's car has a high-resolution, audio-enabled dashcam that records to a secure cloud server. I've spent the last 4 hours in my office with 2 FBI forensic technicians, watching a crystal-clear video of you pulling her over for no reason, berating her with racist language, and then choking her unconscious against the side of her own vehicle. We have it all, Miller, every single second." The color drained from Miller's face. He looked like he'd been punched in the gut. He glanced desperately at his partner, Evans, who was now staring at the floor as if hoping it would swallow him whole. There was no backup coming, no blue wall to hide behind. "Agent Holloway," David said, his voice ringing with authority. One of the agents stepped forward, producing a warrant from his jacket pocket. "Seize all internal and external surveillance footage from this precinct for the last 12 hours. Secure Officer Miller's locker, and take Officer Evans into a room for a formal interview. I imagine his memory might be a bit clearer now." Evans looked up, his face pale with terror, and nodded meekly as the second agent gestured for him to follow. He was going to talk. He was going to save himself. David turned his full attention back to Miller, who now looked small and pathetic. "As for you," David said, his voice dropping to a low growl, "empty your pockets. Now." Trembling, Miller began to pull items from his pockets. Keys, a wallet, a lint-covered mint, and finally, my phone. He placed it on the counter as if it were radioactive. David picked it up, his expression unreadable, and handed it to me. Our fingers brushed, and the simple contact was an anchor in the storm. "Arthur," David said to my lawyer, "please take Maya home. Get a paramedic to meet you there to document her injuries. I will handle things here." Arthur Vance nodded, placing a gentle hand on my arm. "Come on, Miss Turner. Let's get you out of here." As he guided me towards the door, I looked back one last time. Agent Holloway was slapping a pair of handcuffs onto a stunned, defeated Officer Miller. The metallic click was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. Miller wasn't just being arrested by some local IA officer who might sweep it under the rug. He was being taken into federal custody. His career was over. His freedom was over. The days that followed were a blur of depositions, medical examinations, and quiet, healing time with David. The U.S. Attorney's Office came down on that precinct like the wrath of God. The dashcam footage was irrefutable. Miller was charged with multiple federal crimes, including deprivation of rights under color of law and aggravated assault. Facing decades in prison, he had no choice but to plead guilty. Evans, in exchange for his full cooperation and testimony, was fired and lost his certification, a pariah in the law enforcement community forever. The investigation uncovered a pattern of complaints against Miller that had been systematically ignored by his superiors, leading to a full-scale DOJ review of the entire department and the forced resignation of the police chief. We also filed a civil suit, not for the money, but for the principle. The city settled almost immediately for a record-breaking amount, which we donated entirely to a legal aid fund dedicated to helping victims of police brutality. One evening, about a month later, David and I were sitting on our porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple. The bruises on my neck had faded, but the memory remained. "I still can't believe he didn't know who you were," I said softly, leaning my head on his shoulder. David took my hand, his thumb tracing circles on my palm. "He didn't see me, Maya." "He didn't see you either. He saw a stereotype, a caricature he'd built in his head. He saw a black woman in a nice car and assumed the worst. He saw a black man in a suit and assumed he could intimidate me. He never once saw people." He was right. Miller's undoing wasn't that he had accidentally brutalized the wife of a federal prosecutor. His undoing was that he had brutalized a human being. Period. We were just the ones who happened to have the power and resources to ensure he faced a reckoning. As I watched the last sliver of sun dip below the horizon, I felt the cold knot of fear that had been lodged in my chest since that night finally begin to dissolve. Justice hadn't been served just for me. It had been served for every "you" people he had ever wronged, and for every person he would now never have the chance to harm again. And in that, there was a profound and satisfying peace.